All right, here we go. Let's do this. The Caribbean debacle. Indigenous slavery poses a fundamental demographic puzzle. The first Europeans in the New World found a thriving archipelago, islands large and small, covered by lush vegetation, teeming with insects and birds, and alive with humans. The Caribbean was, quote, a beehive of people, wrote Bartholomew de la Casa, the most well-known of the region's earlier chroniclers, who accompanied several expeditions of discovery. Quote, as we saw with our own eyes, he added, all these islands were densely populated with natives called indigenous peoples. The people who greeted Columbus were indeed plentiful. Modern scholars have purposed widely varying population estimates for the Caribbean, ranging from 100,000 to 10 million. But while the initial population is debatable, no one doubts the cataclysmic collapse that followed. By the 1550s, a mere 60 years or 2 generations after contact, the natives, so memorably described by Columbus as, quote, affectionate and without malice, and having, quote, very straight legs and no bellies, had ceased to exist as a people, and many Caribbean islands became eerie inhabited paradises. As very school child knows, epidemic disease was a major reason for this devastation. Europeans introduced pathogens to which the natives had little or no resistance, triggering, quote, virgin soil epidemics. It was like dropping lighted matches into tinder, wrote Alfred W. Crosby in his pioneering work on the depopulation of early Americas. Measles, malaria, yellow fever, influenza, and above all, smallpox ravaged the indigenous population in deadly bouts and spread across the islands. Surely, some indigenous succumbed in pitched battles against the white intruders, who after all possessed superior steel weapons and outmatched mobility with their horses. But by far the Spaniards' most devastating weapon was germs. I gotta get a little mark off my glasses. I got a little spot there. And yet there is a profound disconnect between this biological explanation and what 6th century Europeans reported. Bartholomew de la Casa, who arrived in the New World in 1502, averred that greed was the reason Christians, quote, murdered on such a vast scale, killing, quote, anyone and everyone who has shown the slightest sign of resistance, and subjecting, quote, all males to the harshest and most iniquitous and brutal slavery that man has ever devised for oppressing his fellow men, treating them in fact worse than animals. It is true that Las Casa was a passionate defender of indigenous rights and therefore had every reason to dwell on Spanish brutality, but we do not have to take his word for it. Early chroniclers, crown officials, and settlers also understood the extension of the indigenous peoples as a result of warfare, enslavement, famine, and overwork, as well as disease. King Ferdinand of Spain, no indigenous champion, and probably the most well-informed individual of that era, believed that so many natives died in the early years because lacking beast burdens and the Spaniards quote, had forced the indigenous peoples to carry extensive loads until they broke them down, end quote. Early sources do not mention smallpox until 1518, and a full 26 years after Columbus first arrived in the Caribbean. This was no oversight. 16th century Spaniards were quite familiar with smallpox symptoms and lived in constant fear of diseases of any kind. They were keenly aware, for example, that having sex with indigenous women could cause el mal de las bas, literally, quote, the illness of the pustules or syphilis, which affected several of Columbus' mariners and spread throughout Italy and Spain immediately on their return. As early as 1439, colonialists in the Caribbean also reported an illness that affected both indigenous and Spaniards and was characterized by high fevers, body aches, and prostration. Clinical signs that point perhaps to swine flu. Influenza is usually benign, although it is capable of mutating into deadlier forms, resulting in pandemics. The famous, quote, Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, which wreaked havoc around the world, is only one example. Early Caribbean sources do not describe an influenza pandemic, but merely an influenza-like disease of some concern. There is no mention of smallpox or any other clear episodes of mass death among the natives until the quarter of a century after Columbus' first voyage. Of course, it is impossible to rule out entirely the possibility of major outbreaks that went unreported, but the documentation suggests that the worst epidemics did not affect the New World immediately. Late arrival of smallpox actually makes perfect sense. Smallpox was epidemic in the Old World, which means that the overwhelming majority of Europeans were exposed to the virus in childhood, resulting in one or two outcomes: death or recovery, a lifelong immunity. Thus, the likelihood of a ship carrying an infected passenger was low. And even if this were to happen, the voyage from Spain to the Caribbean in the 16th century lasted 5 or 6 weeks, a sufficiently long time in which any affected person would die along the way or become immune, no longer contagious. There were only two ways for the virus to survive such a long passage. One was for a vessel to carry both a person already affected and a susceptible host who contacted the illness en route and lived long enough to disembark in the Caribbean. The odds of this happening were minuscule. But the demographer, Monsieur Lavie Bacquet, the second possibility was that an infected passenger left behind the live virus in scabs that fell off his body. Since smallpox has now been eliminated from the face of the earth, except in some labs, no one really knows how long the virus could have survived outside the body under the conditions of the. But even if the virus had remained active abroad, a Spanish ship that reached the New World, it would still have had to find its way into a suitable host. In short, far from strange, a delayed onset of smallpox in the New World is precisely what we would expect. Well before smallpox was first detected path of extinction, La Isla Española, quote unquote, the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was the first home of Europeans in the New World. It is a very large landmass, about the size of South Carolina, which at the time of contact was dotted with as many as 500 or 600 indigenous villages, an extreme dispersion that would have militated against the spread of disease. Typically, these were small settlements of a few extended families, except for the handfuls of communities that had 1,000 people or more. No Aztec or Inca cities, but substantial villages nonetheless. Ferreras Casa put Espanola total population at more than 3 million. But given the island's carrying capacity, the archaeological remains of early Spanish population counts for more realistic numbers would be perhaps 200,000 or 300,000. But by 1508, however, that figure had fallen to 60,000. Wow. In 1514, it stood at merely 26,000, according to a fairly comprehensive census, no longer guesswork. And by 1517, the number plunged to just 11,000. In other words, 1 year before Europeans began reporting smallpox, Hispaniola's indigenous population had dwindled to 5% or less of what it had been in 1492. Clearly, the native islanders were well on their way of a total demographic collapse when smallpox appeared to deliver the coup de grace. When we think of the early Caribbean, we imagine mass death caused by pathogens attacking an immunologically defenseless population. But as the case of Hispaniola indicates, this image has been deduced rather than having been directly observed. It began to take shape only 50 to 60 years ago when a group of demographers and historians proposed very high population estimates for pre-contact America. Since there was no way to count the indigenous population of any area of the hemisphere in 1492, these high counters, quote unquote, as they came to be known, derived their estimates by indirect methods, such as taking the earliest population census of the Spanish era and multiplying them by a factor of 10 or more to work their way back to 1492, or using fragmentary population numbers for a small region and applying the same death rates to much more geographic areas. Needless to say, such methodologies proved controversial, although their eye-popping numbers circulated widely. And of course, these numbers raised the question about the causes of the mass decline that followed. Could Spaniards with rusty swords and cumbersome harquebuses have killed so many indigenous peoples? In the Caribbean, for example, fewer than 10,000 Europeans would have had to dispose of an indigenous population that was 1,000 times larger, assuming a high counters estimate of 10 million. To their credit, the original high counters in the 1960s and 1970s acknowledged that the decline had occurred for multiple reasons, ranging from wealth warfare to exploitation to epidemics. But their successors emphasized epidemics, which gradually became the overriding and most logical explanations of an indigenous cataclysmic demise. A more recent consensus is now emerging that revises down the high counter numbers. But smaller populations number for pre-contact America do not make the decline any less dramatic. More modest initial numbers do, however, have a bearing on the possible causes of indigenous subsequent demise. While it is hard to fathom each Spaniard killing 1,000 indigenous peoples with anything other than germs, it is much easier to imagine each conquistador possessing superior technology and motivated by greed. subduing 30 indigenous peoples who ultimately perished through the combination of warfare, exploitation, famine, and exposure to new diseases. We may never know how many native people died solely because of illness and how many perished due to human intervention. But if I had to hazard a guess using the valuable written sources, it would be that between 1942 and 1550, a nexus of slavery, overwork, and famine killed more indigenous peoples in the Caribbean than smallpox, influenza, and malaria. And among these human factors, slavery has emerged as a major killer. The Admiral's first scheme. The Spanish crown never intended to commit genocide or perpetuate the wholesale enslavement of indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean. These outcomes were entirely contrary to Christian morality and to Spain's most basic economic and imperial interests. Yet, a handful of individual decisions, human nature, and archipelagos geography led to just such a daunting scenario. Christopher Columbus' life offers us entry into the tragic chain of decisions and circumstances. Columbus was a visionary mariner, but he was also a businessman, a role that has not a part of the contract. First, Columbus requests 1/10 of, quote, all the merchandises, rather pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, and any other marketable goods of any kind, name, or manner that can be brought or bartered. End quote. Evidently, at the time of the negotiation, Columbus was still thinking about spices, silk, and other products from the Orient, from Asia. But the inclusive formulation of merchandise of any kind of name or matter would have important repercussions for this new world enterprise. Columbus was also able to extract a second concession in the form of an option which functioned in much the same way as the present-day stock option, whereby he would be able to invest 1/8 of the total cost of fitting out all present and future expeditions, in return receive an additional 1/8 or 12.5% of the profits reaped by such ventures. These two clauses meant that Columbus, a single individual, would be able to control close to 1/4 of the overall trade between Spanish Empire and the Asia. I don't know if I'm allowed to say Orient, to be honest. That's why I'm trying to avoid it, even though I just said it now. Yo, what's good, the Brock? If you're still here, probably not. Columbus' first voyage to the New World was successful, and his return to Spain in the spring of 1493 was triumphal. On his way to Barcelona, where Ferdinand and Isabella were holding court, Columbus received an encouraging letter from his sponsor, addressing him with a full title promise, quote, to Don Castelobol Colon, or Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of the islands, and that he discovered in the Indies. End quote. On his arrival, the entire court and city came out to greet him, quote, and the crowd could not fit in the streets, end quote. The next day, Ferdinand and Isabella received the Admiral at the Alcázar warmly, but with great solemnity. The Catholic monarchs rose from their thrones when Columbus approached, and when he knelt down to kiss the hand of his benefactors, they gave him the greatest accolade, reserved only for a handful of grandees. They made him rise and request a chair so that he could be seated in their presence. The Admiral of the Ocean Sea had regaled Ferdinand and Isabella with tales of his voyage and all the marvelous things he had seen. He presented his patrons with some 40 tropical birds, which had, quote, the most brilliant plumage, strange jewels made out of gold, and the 6 indigenous peoples who had survived the passage. So he fucking, oh my God. As one of Columbus' principal biographers has observed, quote, never again would he know such glory, receive such praise, enjoy such favor from his sovereigns. Between celebrations and toasts, the monarch approved of a second and much larger expedition, not just 3 smallish caravels as before, but a fleet of 17 ships, not just a few sailing families and convicts for palos and morgars, but a contingent of 1,500 colonialists for all over the Iberia Peninsula, transporting by professional naval crews. It is hard to imagine the excitement during the summer of 1493, as preparations for that journey proceeded at full tilt. Great promises lay beyond the horizon, and Columbus could only congratulate himself for having insisted on a very favorable terms for a venture that had once seemed like a harebrained scheme, but was now likely to be marvelous and potentially very lucrative reality. The fleet first sailed to the Lesser Antilles, passing the southern coast of Puerto Rico before reaching Hispaniola. Columbus had visited Hispaniola on his earlier voyage, and one of his captains had traded for gold with the indigenous peoples there. So, the second time around, the Spaniards surveyed the island's north coast quite carefully, asking the native peoples about the source of the metal. The locals said that the gold was in the mountain's interior, in the region called Cibo, maybe it's Kibo, in what is now the Dominican Republic. Although encouraged by the presence of the yellow metal, the explorers quickly discovered that panning the riverbed and mining the alluvial placers of Kibo would require time and considerable labor. The voyagers also looked for plants. A few shackfuls of cloves, nutmeg, or saffron would sell out outrageous prices in Europe, and thus could help offset the cost of the fleet. The exotic and varied Caribbean vegetation fooled the explorers at every turn. Columbus thought he saw, oh my gosh, I don't know what this was. RHUBARB. It's rhubarb. Yeah, rhubarb and cinnamon. But none of these prized substances exist in the Caribbean. Chili pepper was the only spice to be had, and even though capsicum would in time transform the cuisines of the world for South Asian curries and Sichuan stir-fried, so Hungarian paprikas. Sorry, everybody. It commanded little attention and no market value at the time. All in all, the colonialist finds were paltry. Some gold, but no spices or silk or any of the other legendary products from the Asian part of the world. And in meantime, the cost of their journey were mounting. All right, 50 centuries of Roman. Okay, here we go. All along, the admiral had been extremely observant of the native islanders, men, women, and children, who went about completely naked, and nearly so, and who often painted themselves from head to toe in red and black. In Columbus' journal, The Letters, we can find many passages about how plentiful, well-proportioned, docile, and alert the Caribbean indigenous peoples were. He committed his comments seem innocuous. However, we need to understand his observation in the context of what he expected to find, as historian Nicolas Way Gomez has recently reminded us. The explorer was a contemporaries subscribed to very old and deeply held notions that linked latitude with character. In this view, belts of latitude wrapped around the Earth and correspond with specific human traits. The inhabitants of the cold zone, quote unquote, in North Europe, for instance, tended to be audacious, but, quote, of lesser prudence, while those of the hot zone, quote unquote, such as the sub-Saharan Africans, were intelligent but, quote, weaker and less spirited. Such ideas about latitude and character, which harked back to Aristotle's and the Ptolemy, and ran through biblical and medieval authors all the way to Columbus, justifies a clear human hierarchy. As luck would have it, the inhabitants of a temperate zone roughly extended across the Mediterranean possessed a perfect balance of strength and prudence, which gave them dominion over the peoples who inhabited their latitudes. The Greeks, the Romans, have shown as much with their conquests, and Portugal's more recent exploits in West Africa had confirmed this natural hierarchy. Had Columbus pilots pointed their compasses due west from the coast of Spain, they would have landed somewhere on the Chesapeake Bay, just south of modern-day Washington, D.C. Instead, the admiral went to the Caribbean because, as he put it, quote, under that parallel of the world close to the equator, more gold and things of value are found, end quote. A prominent cosmographer of the Spanish court elaborated on the same idea, quote, all things come from very hot regions whose inhabitants are black people or people of color. They use dark and Jemu Ferrer del Blanes wrote in a letter to Columbus, quote, and therefore, in my judgment, with your lordship meets such peoples, you shall fail to find an abundance of such things, end quote. By journeying to a part of the world where the sun rays were very strong, Columbus anticipated fine people of color. They used dark and something else. On his first voyage, he wrote in his journals that the indigenous peoples were the color of the Canary Islanders, neither black nor white, end quote, and that their hair was not curly but straight and as coarse as horsehair, end quote. Thus, they occupied an intermediate position between whites and black people, and an observation that was in line with Columbus' expectations, because the newly discovered land lay roughly on the same parallel as the Canary Islands. During the second and third voyage, the admiral traveled farther and farther south, approaching the equator, but the native people's pigmentation did not darken. Columbus and other earlier explorers were at a loss to explain why the indigenous peoples were not black, as in Guinea. Though the sun was strong and the heat was sometimes unbearable in those parts. Regardless of their skin color, Columbus knew these people were intelligent but, quote, weaker and less unspirited, end quote, than Europeans, make them especially suitable as slaves. It is the context of this assumption widely shared by Europeans of the age of discovery, that we must understand Columbus' entries about the docility and the ingenuity of the indigenous peoples, as well as his earliest slaving proposals. Columbus captured perhaps 24 indigenous people during his first voyage. Strictly speaking, these were not slaves, but showpieces, quote unquote, intended as proof of his discovery. The admiral also hoped that these indigenous peoples would learn Spanish and serve as translators on subsequent expeditions. Some of them came from Cuba's north coast, close to a natural port that Columbus named Puerto Mares. On November 12th, 1492, while his ship surveyed the port and river, 6 indigenous peoples in a canoe paddled to the side on one of the caravels to trade. 5 native men climbed up and were easily imprisoned on the admiral's orders. The indigenous people who remained in the canoe narrowly escaped. As there were Columbus sent some of his men ashore to capture more natives. Quote, and they brought men, 7 head of women, between young, old, and 3 children. I did this because the men would have behaved themselves in Spain, having women from their homeland, than they would without them. End quote. Later that night, another canoe approached the Santa Maria, this time containing a man of about 45 years of age, whose wife and 3 children had been captured earlier in the day. He begged the Europeans to take him as well, and the admiral obliged. On the way home, Columbus had occasions to observe his captives in close quarters and to reaffirm his preconception about their tameness, quote unquote, and their quote unquote ingenuity, so characteristics of the peoples in the hot regions. Quote, they began to understand us and we them, rather by words or by signs, end quote. Columbus would later write in these 5 captives, quote, and these have been of great service to us, end quote. The return ocean passage also afforded him time to develop his economic plans, which he included the wholesale export of native slaves. In his very first letter after his return, addressed to the royal comptroller Louis del Centenangle, he promised gold, spices, cotton, and, quote, as many slaves as their majesty orders to make from among those who are idolaters. The admiral's plan to ship natives to Europe was quite understandable given his ideas about the nature of the indigenous peoples, his anxieties about making his discovery economically valuable, and the 1/10 of the proceeds of the sale of these captives that he would pocket according to the terms of the capitulation. Columbus had a model in mind. 10 years before his great voyage of discovery, he had sailed along the coast of Guinea and visited San Jorge del Mani, the first European fortress and trading post in sub-Saharan Africa. The Portuguese had built the fort 1 or 2 years before Columbus' visit in order to protect their claim to the trade on what is now the coast of Ghana. Unannounced, a fleet of very large ships known as Ukras or hulks had appeared on the coast, loaded with bricks, roof tiles, building tools, and scores of masons and carpenters. With Portuguese diplomats overcame the reluctant and the local rulers, and the soldiers made room for the fort by bribing African families to move out of their houses and off their plots. The masons worked around the clock. They completed the tower and in the outer wall of São Jorge de Mana in a record 20 days, amid rising tension. At the time of Columbus' visit, the fort was new and the resident merchants conducted a diversified trade, mostly in gold dust, but also in copper, ivory, salt, and slaves. São Jorge de Mani was still far from becoming one of the most important slaving despots of West Africa, and the infamous Emiliana, as it was known in later centuries, a corruption of the original Portuguese name, where the slaves bound for the New World were kept before crossing the Atlantic. But even in its earlier days, Columbus could observe how a European stronghold on another continent could thrive by trading in variety of products, including humans. There is little doubt that the admiral of the ocean sea intended to turn the Caribbean into another Guinea. Early in his second voyage to the Americas, Columbus sent dozens of Caribbean indigenous peoples back to Spain with the first returning ship. Accompanying them was a candidate letter to Ferdinand and Isabella. Quote, May your highness judge whether they ought to be captured, for I believe we could take many of the males every year and an infinite number of women. End quote. The admiral treaded lightly before touting the quality of the merchandise. Quote, may you also believe that one of them would be worth more than 3 black enslaved people from Guinea in strength and ingenuity, as you will gather from those I am shipping out now. End quote. Columbus' optimistic appraisal of the indigenous slaves had a clear intention. 10 years later, he wrote again to the Catholic monarchs, explaining that his stories of wine and wheat were running low, his stores, requesting more caravels loaded with provisions. He proposed, quote, we could pay for all that with slaves from among these cannibals, a people very S-word and suitable for the purpose of well-made and of very good intelligence, end quote. Columbus' shipment would continue. A year later, in February 1495, he sent 550 indigenous peoples from Hispaniola, crammed into 4 caravels, bound for the slave market of southern Spain. His largest shipment thus far. Michel de Canu, a childhood friend who returned to Europe at this time, wrote an unusual explicit letter about his experience in the New World. Among other things, he reported that his old friend had given him as a present, quote, a beautiful Caribbean girl, Bellissima Cambella, who was brought to my cabin. And seeing her completely naked, as is their customs, the desire to have her came over me. Ew. End quote. About the slaves with whom he traveled, Cuno wrote that about 1,600 captives had been brought to the docks, but only 550 of them, quote, the best males and females, end quote, could be loaded. The rest were distributed among the Europeans who stayed behind or were turned loose. The caravels were filled to capacity. The conditions were extreme. During the passage, approximately 200 natives perished, quote, because they were not used to the cold weather. Canoe, it's Canoe, I think it's Cuneo, wrote, quote, and we cast their bodies into the sea, end quote. Of the remaining indigenous peoples, half were ill and very weak when they finally arrived in Spain. With this voyage, Columbus integrated the Middle Passage completely with the overcrowding and high mortality rates commonly associated with African slavery. The admiral's enslavement plans reached their zenith in 1495 to 1496, quote, under the protection of the Holy Trinity, from here, the Caribbean, we can spend all the slaves needed. We can send all the slaves needed, end quote. Columbus insisted yet again that Ferdinand and Isabella, quote, and if the information that I possess is correct, we could sell 4,000 slaves who will be worth at the very least 20 centos, 20 million maravedis, or 10 times the total cost of Columbus' first voyage. It was a remarkable proposal, considering that so many natives would have to be transported to Spain in 30 or 40 shiploads, but the payoffs would be enormous, even if the admiral's calculations were only half correct. Left to his own devices, the great discoverer would have turned the Caribbean into another Guinea. Yet two factors steered the Colombian experiment in a different direction. First, the Spanish monarchs opposed the enslavement of the natives of America. When the first load of slaves arrived in the spring of 1495, Ferdinand and Isabella initially approved their sales, quote, about the indigenous peoples who came on the caravels, end quote. They wrote to the man of Seville, who foresaw the affairs of the New World, Bishop Juan Rodriguez del Francisco. Quote, it seems to us that they would be more easily sold in Aldulasa than in other parts, end quote. But only 4 days later, the Spanish sovereigns wrote again, countermanding their previous orders and urging Bishop Fonseca to stop immediately the sales of indigenous peoples, quote, until we know whether we can sell them or not, end quote. Ferdinand and Isabella needed time to wrestle with the legal, theological, and moral implication of the transactions. Slavery was a vulnerable institution in Spain, venerable, and throughout the Mediterranean world. Anyone visiting Seville, Venice, Valencia, Barcelona, or any other Iberian city in the 15th century would have come in contact with a variety of slaves. Many of these people were Muslims who had lived in Spain for the centuries and who had been seized as prisoners during the Reconquista, the Christian campaigns to overtake the peninsula. Other captives came from eastern edges of Christendom: Greeks, Bulgaria, Russia, Tartus, Caucasus, and other trade by Mediterranean merchants. More recently, Spaniards had introduced the native inhabitants of the Canary Islands, known as Grunchies, and the Portuguese had sold Africans from the west coast of Africa. But regardless of the providence and circumstances of these captives, they had to go through the same procedures before they could be sold legally. First, they appeared before the Spanish officials, who took the depositions of the captors and critically, the captives to determine whether they were in fact, quote, enemies of the Catholic Church and of the Crown, who had been taken in a, quote, good or, quote, just war. As a practical matter, this was merely a formality as official seldom blocked the sale of captives. But clearly, this bureaucratic practice reflected a deeply ingrained Iberian and more generally Western European belief that proper slaves had to be non-Christian enemies, taken not in slaving raids, but in wars formerly declared by popes and kings. Muslim jihadists clearly fit the bill, but not so, or at least less clearly so, others who regularly appeared shackled in Spanish slave markets. For example, some masters were troubled or uneasy about acquiring Orthodox Christian Greeks as slaves. Therefore, the question before the Catholic monarchs was whether the natives of the New World met these legal standards of enemy, quote unquote, and thus constitutes an enslavable people. Ferdinand and Isabella appointed the committee of lawyers and theologians to help them reach a final determination. This body deliberated for an astonishing 5 years. The case must have been difficult in the extreme. The indigenous peoples of the New World were not Muslims, and they were not waging an offensive war against Spain. Instead, it was the other way around. Unfortunately, the committee final report is now lost, so we do not know what arguments were advanced for and against the enslavement of indigenous peoples, or why the committee deliberated for so long. During those 5 years, however, the monarch's reluctance to enslave indigenous natives intensified. In particular, Queen Isabella emerged as an early champion of indigenous rights, as Columbus kept insisting on his plans of enslavement of his men, continued to ship indigenous slaves in one guise or another. Isabella became exasperated. All along, she had been extremely supportive of the admiral, but by 1499, when she learned that the arrival of yet more indigenous peoples, she famously exploded, quote, "Who is this Columbus who dares to give out my vessels as slaves," end quote. Isabella and Ferdinand freed many indigenous peoples and astoundingly mandated that many of them be returned to the New World. We know that in the summer of 1500s, a group of indigenous peoples was asked whether they want to go back, with the exception of one old man who was too sick to travel and a little girl who wished to remain in Spain. All of the others chose to make the perilous voyage to the Caribbean. The opposition of the Catholic monarchs was a serious blow to Columbus' plans of a transatlantic indigenous slave trade. But the most important limiting factor was the economic development of the Caribbean. European colonialists slowly realized that the lush archipelago was nowhere near the East or the Spice Islands, but nonetheless possessed valuable natural resources. To extract these riches, many laborers were needed. Columbus himself would have sent many indigenous to Castalia, and they would have been sold, and they would have become instructed in our holy faith and our customs, and then they would have returned to their lands to teach the others, end quote. Yet, according to the admiral, they stayed in the Caribbean because the indigenous of Hispaniola were and are the greatest wealth of the island, because they are the ones who dig and harvest and collect the bread and other supplies and gather the gold from the mines and do all the work of the men and beasts alike. The greatest wealth. Where are we at? We're doing good on time. The Spaniards did not so much discover the gold of Hispaniola as they were led to it by the indigenous peoples. The colonialists saw the natives of the north coast wearing shiny, quote, leaves dangling from their earlobes and nostrils. The islanders were in the habit of picking up small pieces of gold and beating them into thin strips or leaves. Using signs, the visitors questioned the natives about where they had procured this gold, to which they responded in kind by pointing to the mountainous interior and saying, Cabo or Saibo. Columbus dispatched a group of some 30 men under the command of Alcyon del Ajodi, a, quote, young and courageous nobleman, end quote, and future slaver, into the promising mountains. Indigenous people plain. The party ascended a mountain range that gave way to the broad interior valley, and then the second range, the Cordillera Central, which was Caibo proper. Large rivers crisscross and foothills of this range. The indigenous escorts were the first to demonstrate how to collect the gold. Quote, they dug a hole in the river sand about the depth of an arm, merely scooping the sand out, and thus through. Oh my gosh. Hold on a second. I have to do a puzzle piece. Yeah, it worked the first time. Trow with the right and the left hand. Oh, trow, like traw. With the right, okay. Wrote one chronicler. And then they extracted the grains of gold, which they afterwards presented to the Spaniards, end quote. The chroniclers, Petro Martiria del Angalethera, Peter Martyr, an Italian nobleman attached to the Spanish court, remarked that many of the grains were the size of peas and garbanzo beans, and affirmed that in Old Castilia he had seen an ingot procured by Ojeda, that was, quote, as large as a man's fist, and to my great admiration, I handled it and tested its weight, end quote. The indigenous evidently placed some value on gold and used it to make ornaments, but the interest shown by the strangers was on a different scale altogether. Gold seemed to be an exception with them. The young noble Ojeda reported that in 2 weeks he had found more than 50 streams of river that contained gold, and that the gold bearing places were so numerous, quote, that a man could not name them all, end quote. The elated Columbus investigated for himself. Wishing to impress the indigenous peoples, he organized a second and much larger group consisting of, quote, all the gentlemen and about 400 foot soldiers, end quote. Proceeding in military formation, these men carried banners, and upon their approach to indigenous villages, fired guns and blew trumpet fanfares. We can only guess what the people of Caibo thought of these theatrics. The material displayed must have worked on some level, because the natives received the strangers, quote, as though they had come from the sky, end quote. The Spaniards had come to stay. They chose a promontory by a riverbank to build and fortify a post they called Santo Tomas, because they liked because just like the doubting saint, they had to see in order to believe. This was the first of the number of fortifications, smelters, mining camps, and placers operations built throughout the foothills and the interior valleys in the next few years. By 1496, the settlers were settlers were firmly in control of Caibo. And by the turn of the 16th century, the gold region of Hispaniola had already become the mainstay of Spanish presence in the New World. Gold was not the only valuable product on the island. Hispaniola was a getaway, a resupply center for expeditions beyond for other parts of the New World. Entrepreneurial colonialists made money by selling pigs and cattle to the passing ships. Other Europeans came to control the trade of dyewood collecting on the southwest coast, and the pearls arrived from Venezuela. Still others found their fortunes in sugarcane, operating the very first sugar plantation in the New World. More than any other enterprises, however, the gold mines determined the economy of Hispaniola and the entire archipelago, and dictated how the Spaniards went about procuring labor. The gold fields of Caibo were not the most dangerous places for the indigenous peoples to work, for sheer honor and attrition rates. The Pearl Coast, quote unquote, was worse. Indigenous peoples divers were spent agonizing days making repeated descents of up to 50 feet, while holding their breath for a minute or more. New natives could endure these brutal conditions for long. Although the gold fields of Caibo were not as lethal, they infected the largest numbers of indigenous peoples in the entire Caribbean region. Looking at the placid environment in modern Caibo, but 500 years ago, it was a site of the first gold rush in the Americas. Columbus initially attempted to squeeze the gold out of Hispaniola, consisted simply of requesting that all indigenous peoples of Caibo who were 14 years of age or older provide enough gold dust to fill the hawk bells and grew a few grams as tribute every 3 months. Hawk bells used in falconry in Europe were brought to the New World as trade goods. Quote, all prudent and learned readers will immediately recognize the justice of this tribute and the violence, fear, and death that its imposition necessitates. Warned Bartholomew de los Cassi, although some chiefs made half-hearted efforts to meet the Spanish quota, this method was obtained gold failed completely. Most indigenous peoples did everything they could to avoid the tribute, including hiding away in the mountains or fleeing Caibo altogether. After 3 collection periods, the indigenous peoples had provided only 200 pesos worth of gold out of the anticipated 60,000. Clearly, if the Spaniards wanted gold from flocked to the streams, savannas, and mountains of Caibo. Although flecks of gold could be found all over the region, only certain areas contained enough gold to make extraction profitable. An earlier colonialist, Gonzalo Fernandez del Alvedo, tried his hand at gold planting and left the most detailed portrayal of these activities. Each Spaniard arrived with his Cordelia, or team of indigenous people. In most cases, the, quote, miner was merely a colonialist with no knowledge of metals or mining techniques. Once he settled on a place, probably chosen after a mixture of hearsay, intuition, and preliminary digging and sampling, he had his indigenous people clear the square trench of about 8 by 8 feet. Sandy beaches along the rivers were ideal, but many alluvial placers were in wooden areas known as argakubas, or long hillsides that required a removal of large rocks and trees. Once the indigenous people completed this preparatory work, they dug the cleared area to a depth of about twice the length of a worker's palm, setting aside the removed sand and earth. They dug with simple tools, even with sticks and their bare hands in the earlier years. This was strenuous labor, but easier than the next step. The same, digging, indigenous people or other members of the quadrilla transported the piles of dirt to the nearest stream. An average sized trench produced more than 6,000 pounds of dirt mixed with the tiniest fragments of gold. The indigenous peoples carried this dirt on their bare backs in loads weighing 3 to 4 arrobas, about 60 to 90 pounds. These were very heavy burdens, considering the slender build of most of the bearers. The work proceeded ceaselessly all day. Instead of using valuable beasts of burdens, the Spaniards compelled natives to do all the hauling. Horses and mules were devoted to the task of conquest and pacification. The indigenous people were even forced to carry their Christian masters in hammocks. As a result, they developed, quote, huge sores on their shoulders and backs, as happens with animals made to carry excessive loads. Commented Ferrer Las Casas, who arrived in Espanola right at the time of the gold rush, quote, and this is not to mention the floggings, beatings, thrashing, punches, cursing, and countless other vexations and cruelties, and to which they were routinely subjected, and to which no crime washings, quote unquote, indigenous, usually women, because this work was less physical, received the cargo, standing in the stream with the water up to her knees, which each woman held a large wooden pan called a bati. Quote, she grabbed the bati by its two handles, wrote Ovido, I don't know how to say his name, and moves it from one side to the other with great skill and art, allowing just enough water to rush in as the earth dissolves and the sand is washed away. This, with some luck, after shifting thousands of pounds of earth, the woman would find, quote, whatever God wishes to give in a day, end quote, a few grains of gold in the bottom of the beta. Each quadrilla consisted of at most a few dozen laborers. The smallest had only 5, two diggers, 2 carriers, and one washer. Yet put together, all these teams made Cabo, a variable anthill. In promising areas, the competition was fierce. When the miner struck gold, others immediately flocked there. To prevent rivals from setting up next to him, he would, quote, invite someone who he wishes to help and chooses as a neighbor to move in first. Even though Columbus and his family attempted to limit the number of Spaniards going to the gold region, the number of quadrillas grew steadily in the late 1490s and early 1500s. During the first decade of the 16th century, the heyday of gold production in Espanola, the island may have yielded around 2,000 pounds of gold per year. It is possible to imagine the enormous ingots and that weight, but it is much harder to comprehend the madness of some of the Spanish owners, one of whom became notorious for throwing parties in which the salt shakers were full of gold dust, or to grasp the suffering of some 3 or 4,000 able-bodied indigenous peoples, perhaps as many as tens of 10,000, toiling daily in the gold mines of Caibo to make such opulence possible for the colonialists. Like any other rush, the gold rush of Hispaniola was chaotic and destructive. Quote, take the most advantage, because you do not know how long it will last, was a saying that circulated among the earlier miners. This bit of wisdom applied not only to the amount of gold one could extract, but also to the number of indigenous peoples one could command. Columbus' initial proposal for enslavement fit perfectly with the labor needs. The first slaves worked in the mines were the islanders who had rebelled during the 1490s and whom the Spaniards had defeated and captured. The end of these rebellions, coupled with Queen Elizabeth's insistence that the indigenous people were free, were through a monkey wrench into his plans and brought to the fore the problem of keeping the mines supplied with workers. The man who had to address the vexing problems of forcing indigenous peoples to work in the mines without enslaving them outright was Nicolas del Avado, the highest political authority in Hispaniola during the gold rush years. At the time of his appointment, Oviedo was already 50 years old, an advanced age in the 16th century for someone who had to travel to the New World to impose his will on strong-minded conquistadors and undominable indigenous peoples. Yet Alvador more than compensate for his age with tremendous energy, loyalty to the crown, and experience. His native Extremadura was a frontier area where Oviedo had participated in the civil wars of the 1470s and 1480s and witnessed the final stages of Reconquista. Real quick, just looking back, not many people probably come in. I don't understand how, like, that one communist can come in. I don't get it. Looks like just people are just coming in and out, I think. Okay. The Catholic monarchs dispatched the aging Oviedo to the Caribbean to restore order to the colonial experiment that had fallen into complete disarray. Columbus had attempted to monopolize the wealth of Hispaniola, initiating a rebellion by Spaniard soldiers who had long mistrusted their commander and now found themselves shut out of the gold mine, sending Oviedo to the island in April 1502 with the almost absolute power and at the head of 30 ships of 2,500 colonialists, by far the largest expedition up to that time. It was the crown's boldest attempt to restore stability. As King Ferdinand reminded Diego Columbus, the admiral's son, quote, "We sent him, Oviedo, to that island because of the bad mistakes committed by your father while discharging the office that you currently have. The island was all up in arms, lost and yielding to benefit whatsoever." Oviedo's views of indigenous peoples quite similar to his perception of Muslim people was that they had to retreat firmly, but not necessarily as enemies or animals. The deeply religious governor may have been a hardened frontiersman, but he was not the heartless slaver. For instance, after visiting the war-torn town of Alcantara, Spain, I don't know how to say that name, in 1496, his initial efforts were directed towards building a new convent and church as a way to receive communal life. In addition to his faith, weighing heavily on his plans for the natives of America was Alvado's close relationship with Queen Isabella, who at the time remained the most determined and powerful defender of indigenous rights. Oviedo, on the basis of past experience and religious conviction, intended to grant the beleaguered islanders a measure of relief in the face of the headlong gold rush and scramble for indigenous laborers. Yet his governorship illustrates the most salient features of the Crown's early dealings with indigenous peoples. Good intentions gone terribly wrong. Oviedo's most important initiatives was to distribute the natives of the island to various encomenderos, or guarantees. In effect, such Spanish guarantee was, quote, given or entrusted with a conquit and his people, making sure in return that they were introduced to the mysteries of Christianity. The contract drawn up at the start of each distribution of indigenous readers. Quote, quote, you are hereby entrusted with the conquit faleno so-and-so and 100 indigenous peoples, so you can make use of them in your ranches and mines and teach them the things of our holy Catholic faith, known indistinctly by the two relevant Spanish words, repartimento, for the verb repartiria, to distribute, and, oh my gosh, encomendenda, from encomendar, to trust, to entrust. This institution amounted to the extraordinary bridge between the vastly different historical realities. In feudal Spain, lords had wielded great power over the peasants who lived in their lands. They had the right to receive tribute from the peasants in exchange for protection. To ensure there were significant differences between the feudal world and the medieval Europe and the encomenda system proposed for Espanola. But at least to some degree, Spanish conquistadors could style themselves as lords of the New World. Interestingly, the encomendin, I don't know how to say it, Encomenda. Maybe I should look it up. Where'd it go? Where'd it go? I hate when I lose it. It's just oh, there it is. Found it. Let me check this out real quick. Was not entirely alien to the islanders. The Taino people of the Caribbean were organized in stratified societies with paramount conquis, exercising control over less conquis and ordinary indigenous peoples. These conquis regularly extracted tribute in products and labor from their independence. It was not a tremendous stretch, therefore, for the islanders to understand the encomenda, I tried, as an extension of their own system, except that now the ultimate beneficiaries were no longer the conquix, but the encomendandros. Alvendando did not intend for the encomendandas to become a distinguished for slavery. He carefully regulated these arrangements, spelling out mutual rights and obligations to prevent sexual predations. For example, Avendando insisted that prospective encomendanderos had to be married, preferably with their wives' presence on the island. Before receiving an encomendenda, I can't say it right, each guarantee had to understand the limits of his authority. He did not own the indigenous peoples in any case of the word, and therefore could not sell them or rent them out. In fact, the indigenous people would continue to live in their own villages under their caquis and by their own rules. The encomendandero did have a right to acquire labor from the indigenous peoples given to him, and he was naturally eager to acquire labor from the indigenous peoples given to him, and he was given to him, and he was naturally eager to send them to the mines. But he had to pay each indigenous persons 1 gold peso per year. Oh my gosh, an absurdly low wage that distinguished encomendinas, indigenous peoples from slaves. The indigenous people would work in the mines only for a limited period, known as the demora, which was initially set at 6 months a year. If the encomendarano failed to abide by these terms, Governor Ovando could take away his, the encomendanda and award it to someone else, a powerful lever in a cutthroat world in which only some Europeans had. Hold on a second. I can't say the dang. I'm going to keep forgetting it's encomienda, which is this. A grant of the Spanish crown to colonialists in American, conferring the rights and demands and tributes to forced labor from the indigenous inhabitants in area. Encomienda. Encomienda. If the encomienda failed to abide by these terms, Governor Ovando could take away his encomienda and award it to someone else, a powerful lever in a cut-through world in which only some Europeans had encomiendas and all others clamor for them. Ovendo's intentions to protect the indigenous peoples is also evident in the fact that he did not distribute all the natives of Espanola, and the governor allowed some cacaquis to continue to live on their own, free and apart from Spanish colonial world. These were natives who had shown the greatest loyalty to Spain and had made the greatest strides in becoming Hispanicized. One of these, Hispanicized. Ooh, that's a new word. One of these fortunes, caquis, also known to the Spaniards as the doctor, because he was the one who knew the most of all of them. Yeah. Another one went by the name of Diego Colon because the admiral had raised him like his own son. Diego taking the boy back to Spain after his first voyage. Diego Colon spoke Spanish fluently and was well known to all the early colonialists. Others included a caqui known as Alonso de Cacaris, which I can't say his name, who lived in Governor Ovando's household for some time. Francisco, who had been raised by Francisca friars in a newly established monastery, and Masupa, Octex, who, oh my gosh, Concakazago chiefdom incongruously lay in the hearts of the cold region. By allowing these Kakuis and their people to live without Spanish interference, the governor wished to show the indigenous people were responsible neighbors and outstanding vessels of the empire, entirely capable of charting their own destiny. Unfortunately, the reality overwhelmed Ovendo's careful plan. Dispersed in 500 or 600 small villages, the islanders became easy prey for Spaniards determined to succeed at all costs. Some conquistadors simply enslaved the islanders illegally. Encomendandi owners also found ways to get around the restriction and safeguards. Instead of keeping indigenous peoples in the mines for only 6 months, they compelled them to stay longer. In fact, being sent to the goldfields amounted to something close to a death sentence. According to one source, quote, out of every 100 indigenous peoples who go, only 70 come back. And in the worst cases, out of 300, only 30 return alive. In their haste to obtain gold, the encomenderos pushed the indigenous peoples beyond the limits of survival. Quote, the greed of men is unsustainable, insatiable, end quote. Committed Gonzalo Fernandez del Avedo. Quote, some owners gave excessive work to the indigenous peoples and others provided them with too little food, end quote. The contemporaries spoke of a quebrantamento, the breaking down of the body, turning laborers into walking cadavers, stripping the will to continue living. Such merciless exploitation was compounded by the constant shifts from the encomendero to another. One more conventus. Oh my gosh. I'm having troubles with these words. Hold on a second, everybody. Covetous than the previous ones, quote, end quote. The encomendas were granted at Alvador's pleasure and lasted 3 years or less. Thus, owners had the incentive to get the most out of the indigenous peoples, even if that meant passing on the famished who repeated the cycle of exploitations with renewed vigor. All right, I'm going to look ahead real quick. We're on page 39. Ooh, there's one. Okay. 39. Okay, I think 39. This is a long chapter. Okay. Oh, okay. All right. We're at 39. Okay. We're going to... Okay. The mysteries also extended to the indigenous peoples who stayed behind in the villages, the elderly, children, pregnant women, and others who were somehow unsuitable for the arduous work in the mines. With all the able-bodied adults gone, they could not raise enough food for themselves, let alone for the scores of men and women returning from the goldfields. Widespread famines affected the islands during the overtures years, and what little food existed was sent to the gold mines. Even the indigenous villages, given a pass by Governor Avendo, failed. Quote, they are improvident. They are improvident, especially about food, end quote. One observer wrote about these communities. Quote, they have a lot of meat or fish. They eat them day in and day out without anticipating the future and realizing that tomorrow they will not have anything, end quote. Prior to contact, these indigenous people had enjoyed a seemingly carefree lifestyle, but the harsh colonial demands rendered their traditional practices untenable and their survival impossible. Despite Ovendo's well-intentions administration, the gold rush wiped out the island's population. The mines destroyed the Tainos working there, and in the process doomed those left behind of the 2,500 colonialists who had arrived in Espanola with Governor Ovendo, and he had received an encomendenda, I don't know how to say that word, in the gold fields of Caibo, where he observed the cataclysmic decline of the indigenous peoples. He believed that 3 million indigenous peoples had died in just a few years. Quote, will believe this. I myself, who I am writing this and saw it and know most about it, can hardly believe that such was possible. No, another knowledgeable contemporary writing a few years later, Pedro Martí del Aguirre, I don't know how to say his name, expressed the same idea. Quote, let us be strictly truthful and add that the wild for gold was a cause of their destruction. He wrote to the Pope, quote, for these people who were accustomed, as they had sown their fields to play, dance, sing, and chase rabbits, were set mercilessly to work. By 1508 and 1509, the surviving islanders could no longer sustain the gold production of Caibo, let alone raise food, build towns for the Spaniards, and do all the other work acquired of them. Avidos himself realized the depths of the crisis and the failure of his policies, proposed a dramatic and far-reaching solution, bringing indigenous slaves from the surrounding islands to work in the gold mines and other endeavors of Espanola. The new chapter in the sad history of earlier Caribbean had begun. Los Amoradores. All right, we're gonna stop there. We're stopping on 40, page 40. Nope, it won't let me do it. Will it let me do a book point? Will it let me do a... Won't even let me do a freaking bookmark. What's up? What's up?
This book was really interesting.
Okay.
I really enjoyed learning about Espanola because isn't that Haiti and the Dominican Republic now?
That's what they said.
So it's no longer Taino people that are the majority of the people there.
What?
Isn't Taino, the indigenous people?
Taino.
Yeah, Taino. The Taino people are no longer the majority of the people there?
I don't know, but they had a high rate of genocidal rates, and Taino people still exist. I just don't know if they're the main force, so I don't know much of that. I just know that in history, they were decimated by these people. As we can see now, as they're talking about the gold mines and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, let's see here. I'm trying to do this.
I did not like the fact that they said Columbus was okay. They didn't talk bad about Columbus, and they should have.
Why did they say Columbus was okay?
At the beginning.
Who said that?
The writer of the book.
So the first page?
Let me go back and see if I can find it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You're gonna have to tell me what page you're on when I get done, though.
I'm on 40.
Yeah.
Not saying you're wrong. I just want to make sure we're precise on these things. Okay, page 40. Okay, good. We're done. All right, let's see if it... All right. Yeah, okay, good. All right, page 40. There's someone in the crest. I don't know what they want. I'm going to see what they want real quick, okay?
Okay.
Unless you found it. Did you find it?
I didn't find it yet, but I'm reading along at the beginning. It's right around here somewhere.
All right, cool. Let's see what this person wants. It won't let me accept it. Why can I not accept? Request canceled. Oh, it got canceled. Okay. Okay, it's not there anymore. But this is important work because, like, they utilize the indigenous population for cheap labor. Yeah, and then try to Christianize them a little bit too.
I can't find it unless I read the whole thing all over again. I'm not in the mood.
Rachel, during those times it was different. They didn't like if you read the whole details, they talked about how like they wouldn't enslave Christians in a sense, or they were only enslaving Muslims at that time that were enemies, and they didn't see the indigenous people as enemies because they weren't Muslims at that point. So that queen, with a little bit of success, whatever, like didn't do much besides say words, like said those things. But the conquistadors didn't give a fuck about that part and still did the slavery with inside Espanola. I agree that the Christian Bible talks about slavery and talks about how to keep your slaves. But again, these people, they call them sovereigns because they were the only people that were sovereign. Like the nobles and the ruling class were the sovereigns, right? So they can determine and depict what is law and what is not law based on that, because we all know that Christianity is a man-made faith built on these nobility people to be able to dictate who they think is. So in that time, yes, the Bible says that, but during that time, but like, again, it didn't negate the fact that they still tried to do the enslavements of indigenous people and they're on their own islands and stuff. And it didn't stop those loopholes and stuff like that to try to make them, you know? So yeah, they like the other part is they tried to assimilate them into Christianizing them too, which is another assimilation and horribleness, but that backfired on them too, in a sense. But like, yes, you're right. All right, anything else, Joe?
Nope, that's it.
All right, does anybody else have anything else? I hope I didn't make anybody upset. Yeah. So like that's the problem with the Bible. That's the problem with scriptures, because anybody can interpret it any way they want to, can make up anything they want in order to make a law. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So they changed the Bible up. How many times has the Bible been revamped? Hundreds of times, thousands of times, right?
Yes.
Just
Did you notice your highlights?
Yeah. What? Oh wow, that's a lot. But like, no, I agree with you, Rachel, on that part though too. But like, again, these people can make up anything that depict anything to be able to keep people subjugated and controlled. You know what I mean? All right. If anybody doesn't have anything else to say, no one else has anything to say. Yeah, like 1,000 times. Yeah, you're right. You know, that's why I don't know. It's a book that's basically just fantasy book. It's a fantasy book for white people. All right, then. Well, I'm going to close it down. All right. I appreciate everybody. Thank you. And I'll see you all later.